what are estrogenics? Like what are these things?
Mhm. Yeah, man. So when I was doing my PhD, I did a PhD at Boston University Medical School on the topic of cholesterol and sex hormones. And the connection between those, by the way, is that sex hormones like estrogen, testosterone, progesterone, they're made from cholesterol, right? And as I was researching that whole world, I came across artificial estrogens, like these chemicals that act like estrogen in our bodies. And they're unnatural, right? Like they're made from petroleum generally, but there's some that are found in nature. Like soy makes a chemical that acts like estrogen. So certain plants can make estrogens. And so estrogenics is just a term that basically means something that acts like estrogen in your body. Could be natural estrogen, could be plant chemicals that are tricking your body into thinking there's more estrogen. It most often is petroleum based artificial chemicals found in fragrances or birth control or just plastics. So that's kind of estrogenics, something that acts like estrogen.
Okay, so like just how prevalent are these in
Mm.
our like food supply and like just in our day to day lives?
Super prevalent. Yeah, man. So I made a top 10 list in my book, and Agent Orange, the chemical that's super toxic, they use it in warfare. That screws with your hormones, but we're not exposed to that every day. So what I focused on in my book are chemicals that we're exposed to every single day. And that's a top 10 list. I mean, that gives you an idea of how bad these things are because, you know, there's 10 of them. And for example, atrazine is one of them. Atrazine is a chemical herbicide they spray on grains. It's actually in America, it's the second most commonly used herbicide. And it acts like estrogen, well known, well established. It screws with your hormones, it lowers your testosterone. Um, so it goes beyond the plastics, although the plastics are a huge component of this. There's a lot of different chemicals they use when they're making plastics that leach into water and leach into oil and leach into liquids that act like estrogen.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, there's a lot. And the problem is too, if it was just one of these chemicals, you could do a toxicity study and say, look, here's the dose that's safe and that's it, right? And that's a hard study to do because it might take 10 years, right? Because breast cancer or something like that, like breast cancer is up 250% since 1980. Massive increase in breast
Wow,
cancer. Yeah, and it takes a
250%.
long time to develop breast cancer, right? It's not like an overnight thing that you can pick up in a 6 week scientific study.
Yeah,
So,
but
so
two
that
hundred and
something like,
fifty percent.
oh yeah, it's
So
exploded.
that's like what? That's
Mm-hmm.
like 20. No, wait, two and a half times as many women are getting
Mm-hmm.
breast cancer. What, like
Exactly.
annually? Wow.
Yeah. In some countries, it's 500%. Like the Philippines and some of these countries where they have more industrial creations of plastics that they're shipping over to the US. It's just jumped exponentially. Uh,
And are those
and
numbers population adjusted? Like do they account for
mm-hmm,
population growth?
per 100,000. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. For sure. Right. And by the way, the population hasn't jumped 250%. So even if it wasn't population adjusted,
Yeah.
it's not
No.
like we've doubled in population in America or whatever.
And like, is it anything to do with like the age of the population? Possibly.
It could be a little bit. Yeah, probably contributing a little bit. But
Hmm.
no, I
But
mean,
not
younger
that
women are getting
significantly.
it too.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's true of depression and other stuff too. There's a lot of things that are on the rise that you know maybe there's some age contribution, maybe there's just more awareness, right, and all this kind of stuff. But you either have breast cancer or you don't. Like it's not necessarily an awareness thing. It's pretty obvious when you have it.
Hmm.
Um, but especially when you're in a third world country and you're getting it, right, because then it gets really grotesque and and it develops a lot further along than it should. And so, but the point is, if you were studying one single chemical and you had a long enough period, you could make a pretty good idea of what the toxicity is and whether or not we should have any of it or a little bit exposure. But the problem is when you have 10 chemicals, right? Um, nobody's doing a study with 10 chemicals and they're saying, well, this is 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 eventually equals 10. And these are all acting like estrogen. So they're actually all compounding the problem. And that's a huge problem in the way our research is set up, because we do toxicity studies. We do them on a very short time scale, but at least we do them. But nobody's doing them in multiplicity. Nobody's adding additional chemicals to those toxicity studies, even though it's probably a logical thing to do.
Okay, so then I'm sure, yeah, there's definitely other examples I've heard you cite, but just of the things that we've spoken about, and like the rise in cancers, depressions, lots of things like this. Like, what is the connection between these like estrogen mimicking chemicals and the rises in those things? Like, what's the connection there? What's that doing to the body that you think it means that's the cause?
Yeah, it's tricking the body. So breast cells, especially in women, are very hormone sensitive, right? So if you disrupt that delicate balance, then suddenly you've got cells that are growing way too fast and growth is misregulated and out of control. Boom, it's cancer. Depression is harder to figure out, right? Like a good example of depression with hormone disruption is postpartum depression. Women have a baby, their hormones get all screwed up, and they get depression. You bring in a bunch of plastic chemicals, a bunch of atrazine from herbicides, a bunch of fragrance chemicals made from petroleum, all acting like estrogen. Boom, you end up with depression. Even children, by the way, they've done studies where they look at people's urine of BPA, for example, and phthalates. And the more of that stuff is in their urine, the more depression they have. In children, which shouldn't even be getting depression, like little kids, like age 9, I think was the average age in that study, in the BPA study. So it's disrupting the brain because the hormones are impacting our brain, right? Like, especially testosterone is another good example, because with exposures to these chemicals, testosterone lowers, and that lowers sex drive. It lowers it changes the way people think. Even in animal studies, if you lower their testosterone by giving them a bunch of these chemicals, they don't pursue the female rat as much, or whatever species you're interested in. It changes. It's called sexual apathy. Like, they just don't care. And so you see that in our culture, right? Or it causes gender dysphoria, right? Like, you get like a confused gender physically. You see it physically, like it changes the gonads, it changes sexual organs, and you see it at a mental level in the brain, because it's changing the way your brain is working. And again, the brain is tricky to study, but it's definitely, you can see it in reality when you do these studies. And I think you see it in the culture too. So anytime you can think about pregnancy, it's probably a good model for hormone changes. Like for women, when they get pregnant, their estrogen goes way up, right? So they start at like 200 and then goes to 2000. And when that happens, you get a lot of weight gain, right? Like the body stores more fat. Women will tell you this because our ancestors didn't always have access to food for thousands of years. So it's actually an adaptation to store more fat for pregnant women, because fat is a real efficient storage form for energy. It's good for energy storage. And if they didn't have food, then the fetus can still have calories and things, because there's a lot of fat there. And what happens if you put a bunch of atrazine into somebody, or a bunch of phthalates or BPA? We get fat, like we gain a bunch of fat weight, right? Our body thinks we're pregnant, even if we're men or women or whatever, it doesn't matter. You're basically imitating that process in a screwed up way, right? In a dysfunctional way or perverted way. So you can see a lot of reflections in nature that are just perverse with these artificial chemicals, the depression, the low testosterone, the infertility. Of course, it disrupts your fertility, right? Like, you're altering your sex hormones. That's one of the main functions of sex hormones, is to monitor and regulate fertility cycles and fertility in general. So I know I threw a lot of stuff at you there, but that's kind of the big picture.
Hey everyone, thanks for making it right the way to the end of the podcast. I love that you tuned in this long. Do me a favor, hit subscribe, because 80% of you bastards are not subscribing, but you're watching my videos. See you next time.